So one question about whether or not wages adjust with the unemployment rate is whether or not we shift up the wage curve due to what the book calls fair shares bargaining, where the idea is that workers argue that they should get the same share as before, and so instead of moving from A to B in this graph and having a reduced unemployment rate, we move from A to C, where the real wage is the same because that's determined by the profit curve, but we stay at a 6% unemployment rate. And as I said so far, it looks like the relationship between the unemployment rate and technological growth is, if anything, just sort of non-existent. The unemployment rate seems somewhat independent of technological growth, with possibly some evidence that the unemployment rate falls. So, more evidence maybe that we go from A to C, but certainly some evidence that we move from A to B. So what we want to think about then is, if there's not this clear relationship between average unemployment rates and real wage growths, what separates what the book calls the low performers, so the United States, Canada, Belgium, Italy, Spain definitely, from the high performers, countries like Norway and Japan, and what are the countries in the middle doing? Is the UK doing something different than Finland or the Netherlands? We see a lot of the sort of Nordic countries up here, more Southern European countries over here, and North American countries as well. So we want to think about that a little bit. So we'll take a quick look at sort of four countries. Spain is clearly an outlier of, pretty high unemployment, not great labor market institutions. Italy, a bit like Spain, but not quite as bad, whereas Japan and Norway have really experienced low unemployment uh, over the last 40 years, and despite the fact that they've had pretty high real wage growth. And so let's take a look at those countries a little bit. The biggest difference for Norway and Japan is that they've been able to have sort of inclusive labor market institutions that have raised wages across the board. Spain is a country that has strong labor unions, but they tend to be company focused rather than industry focused, and so they try to protect the jobs within their company, which means that uh, companies don't have as much flexibility in adjusting to new technology. And what we've seen is that has resulted in high unemployment rates. And that is true to a certain extent of Italy as well. Japan doesn't have union representation per se, but what they do have is strong employee associations that work in the bigger companies to set wages and try to spread the benefits of wage growth. And so, in order to achieve these good outcomes, like Norway and Japan, is you need to ensure that the profit curve shifts more than the wage curve, right? So that we end up with lower unemployment and higher wage growth, and that it happens quickly so that the whole economy benefits. So we're not stuck with industries that have low wages and high unemployment. Let me put myself up here. So there's this idea that the book talks about, which I think is important, of inclusive trade unions. Inclusive trade unions are a little bit different than the unions that we often have in the United States, sort of, right? So back in the heyday of union strength in the United States, we had the AFL-CIO that represented a lot of workers in a lot of different industries at a lot of different firms. And that was probably the closest that the United States had to inclusive trade unions. Whereas in Europe, in a country like Germany, for example, trade unions represent people across companies, across industries, and that allows them to not try to bargain up their own wages so high that it hurts job creation in the long run, right? So they're interested in sort of the overall health of the labor market rather than the real wages in one particular company or even one particular industry. We can also think about unemployment insurance schemes, job placement services that help companies and countries achieve low unemployment rates. But as the book says, there's no magic formula. There's nothing that would clearly allow companies and countries to always get low unemployment and high growth at the same time. So we can see here that the unemployment rate, which is on the vertical axis, and the employees covered by union wage bargains, uh, there's really no relationship, right? So Spain has employees covered by union wage bargains over 80%, but they have really high unemployment rates. Whereas Japan and Korea have very weak unions, but have really low unemployment rates, similar to the United States. And so whereas, Austria, the Netherlands, they have a lot of union representation, but also really low unemployment rates. So there's no real clear relationship between unionization writ large and the unemployment rates, but there is a difference, the book argues at least, between inclusive unions and their ability to adapt to technological change more easily. So if we look, for example, at Spain, which has less inclusive unions, right, but a high unionization rate, and Norway, which has more inclusive unions, if we go back up, we can see Norway is here around 65, 70% unionization. Spain is around 80% unionization. We can see completely different Beveridge curves, right? Spain has a really flat Beveridge curve where the unemployment rate has big changes related to the vacancy rate, whereas Norway, they can have really big changes in their vacancy rate, at least relatively, but they have really small changes in the unemployment rate. So between 2001 and 2013, over the time of the Great Recession, the unemployment rate looks like it ranged from about 3% to less than 5%. So very small differences. There's also not a huge relationship between how generous unemployment benefits are, which is here on the horizontal axis, and the unemployment rate. So we can see Denmark and Norway, which both have fairly low unemployment rates, have very generous unemployment benefits. The UK, Japan, and Korea have much less generous unemployment benefits and also have low unemployment rates. Whereas, Slovakia, Poland, Spain have different benefit rates but higher unemployment. And so, one of the arguments is often, we shouldn't have really generous unemployment benefits because people will just be happy being unemployed. That doesn't seem to be the case in at least the Nordic countries of places like Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden. So that's something else to keep in mind. Now, if we look at the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, they both have experienced lower unemployment rates recently, although the Netherlands a little bit more than the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has moved more in the direction of the United States, which is to weaken unions and to make their labor market more flexible so it's easier to hire and fire people, whereas the Netherlands has moved more in the direction of inclusive unions. And as we've seen, they've had a fairly good experience with that in terms of lower unemployment and reasonable real wage growth. So there's sort of two ways that you can lower the unemployment rate, really in the United Kingdom way and the United States way, that comes through lower real wages, whereas in the countries like the Netherlands, that comes, at least it seems to come, with somewhat higher real wage growth. One of the successes that the United States has had is that the unemployment rate in manufacturing has actually fallen between the 20 years between 1970 and 1990 versus the 20 years between 91 and 2011. The unemployment rate has fallen and real wage growth has increased slightly. Now, personally, I think that the United States just sort of experienced the drop in real wage growth before some of these other countries. So you can see the US was experiencing the lowest real wage growth during the 70s and 80s in manufacturing compared to all these other countries that were probably experiencing some of the growth that we had experienced in the 50s and 60s. And then they all sort of moved down, right? So you can see Germany's unemployment rate went up, their real wage growth went down. Spain experienced a really big drop. Italy, the unemployment rate didn't go up too much, but real wage growth fell dramatically. And that was really true of all of the countries. And I think part of that probably had to do with the fact of the transition from the OECD, the rich countries that are listed here, dominating the world economy, to one in which there was growth in other parts of the world. So India, China, uh, Korea, Taiwan, the countries that aren't listed here, right? I think if we looked at like real wage growth and unemployment in China, we would see that it was pretty high. So, what are the institutions, the policies that are going to affect the unemployment rate and real wage growth? Well, a lot of it's going to come from technological change, right? And so the policies that are important there are competition policies, research and development, patents, things that will encourage companies to invest in new technologies, develop new technologies, and bring them to market. Um, that's going to lead to job creation and destruction, to firm entry and exit. And what needs to happen there is that we need to make sure that for people whose jobs do get destroyed, that we help them find, new work in new industries that are growing. If we're able to do that, then they can experience more real wage growth. There can be less of that drop in total wages. Um, and one of the ways to do that is by these sort of inclusive unions, industrial relations legislation that encourages real wage growth, encourages innovation, but also protects workers. And that hopefully will lead to both more employment and to lower unemployment rates and higher real wage growth. So, are the robots coming to steal our jobs? I don't think so, right? So far in US history, um, and in the history of the world, technological growth in the long run has meant more jobs and better paying jobs. That said, as we saw with the Malthusian trap model, that model had been correct for the last, 5,000 years until the industrial organization happened. And of course, it's possible that we're at a new time frame and new technology of, artificial intelligence and robots are going to represent something different compared to the technological growth that's come before. And of course, we can't know that. One of the things about the future is that it's hard to predict.